Today is July 10th, 2014. My name is Cheryl Walker. I will be interviewing Dick Fox. We are in Springfield, Illinois at the American Legion Convention. June, Hamey will be the court reporter. Dick Fox was born on October 17th, 1947. Mr. Fox, for the record, can you tell us what branch of service you served in?
What
branch of service?
I was in the Marine Corps.
Okay. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Monticello, Illinois, October 17th, 1947.
Okay. And who were your parents?
Robert and Dorothy Fox.
Okay, and what did your parents do for a living?
Dad was a bomber pilot in the Air Force through World War II. After that, he came home and on the Monticello Square opened a clothing store. At that time, there weren't the big Walmarts and people shopped locally. And then he was a traveling salesman for those suits and back in those days, men's raincoats and things, and traveled the Midwest. And my mother just worked at home. We had some farm stuff here and there.
Did you have any siblings?
I had two brothers. One was an accountant, CPA, a big time, and the other was a graduate of the Naval Academy and was the officer of the deck of the USS Enterprise and flew A-6s in the 70s in Vietnam and other places. And he's now a world-class veterinarian, travels the world giving speeches. He instructs veterinarians.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
Out of high school, I went to the University of Missouri to play baseball, and did for 1 year. But the Vietnam War was ramping up, and I just had that bug. And the summer after my freshman year, a friend of mine from Monticello, we're sitting on the Sangamon River on a couch we'd stolen and placed out in the middle of the woods, and we decided then that summer that we wouldn't go back to college, that we'd join the Marine Corps. So we did. That person is on the cover of this book. That guy. We went in on the buddy plan. There's more to that story that's pretty interesting if you want to hear it.
Sure.
We went in. We actually went in October, and we did go to boot camp together. After boot camp, he went to Camp Pendleton, which is just up the coast from San Diego. Camp Pendleton, divides L.A. from the San Diego cities. I went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Mike Hilton got orders for Vietnam and went while I was in North Carolina. And then I got orders for Vietnam, and I went late fall '67. And Vietnam is a big, busy, violent place. And I helicoptered into Quang Tri on Christmas Eve 1967 in the midst of a mortar and rocket attack. And when I got off the helicopter, they said, go to the north perimeter and guard that area tonight. And I ran up there and jumped in a foxhole, and my buddy Mike was in that foxhole. And that's where that picture came from. Christmas Day, 1967. So obviously the story went on. He did survive the war, but then died later. So, and regardless of the form we filled out, I still don't have a death date. So Vietnam, and we were in I-Corps, south of the DMZ, about 12 miles, and it was a really busy place. That date is fairly critical because Christmas, December '67, was about 30 days before the infamous Tet Offensive started that changed everything. Mike moved on north, and I stayed in Quang Tri during the Tet Offensive. But I was in helicopters, so I was all over the place. I was in Quezon and Con Thien, and they shipped us into the Battle of Hue, and whatever was hot, we went to. But we went out of Quang Tri. When I first got to Nam, I was in a Marine Air Group 36, which was known as the Purple Foxes. We later got a presidential citation for lots of stuff that we did. But they wanted somebody to go to Quang Tri. I was a sergeant, And they told me if I went and lived, that after 6 months I could come back to Fubai and basically stay out of the action. So I said, well, I'll go to Quang Tri, and that's how I got there. And so right before the Tet Offensive, the timing couldn't have been worse. So we flew into Khe Sanh twice a day, and a lot of places. And so later I went back to Fubai and got myself an office chair and went to the Sergeant's Club and said, I'm your new bartender. And I tried to stay out of trouble the last 3 or 4 months. That didn't always work because by that time I had so much experience that they wanted me to do a lot of stuff. So those months and all are what I go through in this book, The Domestic Vietnam, that I finally sat down and wrote. But I was a sergeant the whole time. Then when I came back, my enlistment was up and I had orders to be a drill instructor. But I was only 20 years old. And I would have gotten a promotion, which would have made me a staff sergeant. And the orders were for 2 years at the MCRD, Marine Corps Recruiting Depot in San Diego. And I knew after those 2 years I would get another promotion, which would make me a gunnery sergeant with Vietnam experience. And I knew what would happen to me. And I just barely lived through the first tour. So I didn't think there was any way I'd live through another tour. So that's when I got out. And I got out. They talk about PTSD. We didn't know what that was then. And I flew into Okinawa back to California. I think about October 20th, 68. And I was on campus at Charleston, Eastern Illinois University, I think by November 1, which I really did not recommend. Back then, you didn't know you had post-traumatic anything. But to take somebody 2 weeks after being in Vietnam and place them a bunch amongst the college kids is not a good disposition. That led to all kinds of other things. But anyway, that was some of my Nam years. But out of Quang Tri, we flew into Khe Sanh, which is rather famous, and time and time again, twice a day. And then we got orders. I was a crew chief, a machine gunner, that we would go support the 1st Marines and the 5th Marines in the Battle of Hue. So it seemed like every time I was to go someplace, I was kind of hoping, well, this is going to be good because it can't be quite as hot as the last place. But in the Tet Offensive days, they were all hot. I mean, there was no place for Marines to be that wasn't hot. So it didn't seem to make any difference. So then I went back to Quang Tri and flew out of Quang Tri for till June, I guess. And then there's stories nightly. I think at Quang Tri we were attacked 32 nights in a row, which just creates chaos, not only in where you live but in your own mind. One night, I think about February 10th, we killed about 600 North Vietnamese right there in one night. I didn't plan on doing this. So, what else can I tell you?
Why did you become a Marine?
Well, I was at the University of Missouri, and my buddy there, Mike, he was at Southern Illinois University, and I had come from a military family, kind of. At that time, my brother was at the Naval Academy. My grandfather was a German immigrant and lived through his home country fighting his new country. And he never got over that. And my dad was a World War II pilot, and it just seemed like playing baseball at the University of Missouri wasn't quite up there with what was expected of me. The war was ramping up the whole time. One of the things about guys my age is the whole time you're growing up, I say in the book that it was 6 years from Little League to boot camp. And that really is the essence of that maturing process in the 60s. So Mike and I didn't want to join the Army. If we're going to go, we're going to go as Marines. So we did. And we went to the recruiter and flew to boot camp. In those days, boot camp was 12 weeks, but it was pretty much understood what was going to happen to you. You know, they were just training people for Vietnam. And later, they ramped it up faster to replace those wounded and dead from the Tet Offensive. I mean, there's a lot of those units that went pretty unprepared. And the rotations got quicker. And if you did what I did, flying into all these places, we flew in supplies and ammo when we took out body bags, you know, daily. In fact, most of the action, 68 was in the Tet Offensive months, which was February, March. I don't remember the total numbers, and I might have to review the math, but I think in 1968, 17,000 U.S. young soldiers were killed in that 1 year. And I think that adds up to like 60 a day. I'm not sure. I think that's what it comes out to. Well, that makes things pretty crazy, not only there, but at home. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons this book is titled The Domestic Vietnam is because of 68. And in America, I don't know how old you ladies are, but it's in 68 is when they had the urban riots and King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. The Democratic National Committee, they were burning, I think they burnt 40 cities down, Baltimore and Newark and Toledo, in that year. So I wanted to write something about not only what the devastation in Vietnam in 68. 68 is known as the defining year. That was when the PR and the pablum bull could no longer be overlooked. That we're in a war that we don't know what we're in for, and we ain't going to win it. Nobody even knows what winning looks like. So when you're killing 57 young Americans a day, or 60, and leadership is blowing smoke about domino theories and saving us from communism, while Cuba 90 miles away is growing communism as fast as they can. If you're on the ground in Nam and every other day something is going on in the United States that makes no sense while you're in a war that makes no sense. And they talk about veterans. Everybody did their job on the ground in the war. I mean, that guy up there was a helicopter pilot. I mean, those guys are brave. I have sat in command bunkers at 3 a.m. where orders are passed down for helicopter groups to go out to some fire zone or landing zone that's under bombardment. And people just shook, and you know, it just made no sense. And of course, in Vietnam, every time you won something, you occupied it for 30 days, and then you left it. It just got worse and worse and worse. And so this book is a lot of research about that and what really was going on in Quezon and what really was going on in the Battle of Hue, and those places where I was in and out of for that year. And that year is what changed everything. That's when the famous Walter Cronkite finally closed his newscast with, "What are we doing?" Now, I came to some conclusions about what we're doing and why Vietnam. If you ask people why Vietnam, they pretty much give you an answer of stopping communism. But that wasn't the reason. And I don't know that I'm going to give the reason on this thing to you. But it's in this book. I came to that conclusion after writing and studying this thing for 4 years. Not only that, it is the same in Afghanistan. There is no winning Afghanistan, and we're not going to. and it's almost the same kind of twisted illogic that has us there for so long with so many assets invested. And I don't think it's about winning Afghanistan at all. It's with the radio show that I do and the book, it gives me a chance to talk to lots of veterans, way more than are in the book or on the radio shows, because if I talk to 5 or 6 veterans, maybe only one of them will be on the radio show. And it pretty much is the same thing, and I say this in the book, that the common knowledge is that Vietnam veterans don't talk. Well, if you're on a bar stool in a casino, no, they don't, because that's not talk, that's gossip. Or if you're at a wedding reception or a ball game, oh, you were in Vietnam? Well, tell me about it. Well, why? You don't give a shit. Or I shouldn't do that, should I? You don't care. You know, you're just filling time, and I'm here, and you just think you need something to ask me. So that's why they don't talk. But they'll talk to me, and they do. And it takes the same tone almost 100% of the time. I don't even know if I've talked to one where it varied. I'm presuming you want to know what that tone is. Well, the tone is do your duty. You know, it's pride of service. But then when you talk a little more, it changes. They're pissed. You know, they were bait. I related to, do you know what the Hessians are? Okay. You do?
History.
Excuse me?
You're talking history?
Yes.
Yeah.
European history.
Yes.
You know what the Hessians are? Good for you. Well, in the America's Revolutionary War, late 1700s, Europe was not organized in countries yet. There were kingdoms and fiefdoms and all. So the British went to Germany and basically hired Hessians to do their fighting, mostly around New York. Okay, so it's this surrogate group that really in the beginning didn't have an interest, but now is hired by somebody that thinks they have an interest to go do their fighting for them. And of course then they stayed. So here we are in Vietnam, and we have a draft, and we have American leadership that is most interested in a military-industrial facade of domino-falling communist fighting. So the new Hessians of the 60s and 70s, excuse me, become what I call the Wilson Street Boys through draft boards. And the dynamics of the 60s were you can get deferments for various things, and but some people like me didn't even consider deferment. Some were in the National Guard, but here's this group swept up from streets and neighborhoods. I call them Wilson Street Boys for a reason too. And we're plunged into this war, which has nothing to do with fighting communism, I concluded. It's still a post-World War patriotic, do your service environment. And it certainly was at my house. The 60s were famous for new types of ranch homes with basement bars and all that. And in my neighborhood, the veterans gathered at the basement bar and talked about World War II, which my dad was a officer pilot. And so I kind of grew up listening to all that. And then the Vietnam came along, and I heard probably for 4 or 5 years, don't worry, that's not much, and it'll be over by the time you get old enough to go. Well, we couldn't have hit it any better, you know. In our little town on the north end, there's a street called Wilson Street. All of us kids grew up on Wilson Street. Just a fate. All my buddies. I mean, like 15 of us. And we all went to Vietnam after years of everybody going, well, it'll be over by the time you get old enough. And that's why I say it was 6 years from Little League to boot camp. I mean, there were several Marines. It was my brother who was the officer of the deck of the USS Enterprise, ran the whole thing. A couple Green Berets, Special Forces Army. I mean, you could go right down Wilson Street. So in the book, I have a whole chapter on Wilson Street, but it really was representative of what was going on all across America. Then through the book, I keep referring to the Wilson Street boys, meaning all of us guys of that age, of that time, and what happened to us. And then in there is, so what's going on? If you've got a little town like Monticello, and from one street or a block off either way, there's 15 or so guys. What really goes on Wilson Street, in the middle of the Tet Offensive with these parents and girlfriends and aunts and uncles, and so everybody went through it, and that's also why domestic Vietnam, because the war was in America. That was a surrogate location, and when they began to characterize a domino effect of communism, it came to be true to me that, yeah, it was a domino effect, but the dominoes were in America, falling one to the other, with mostly in Washington, with modern-day Hessians, which was me and whoever was healthy enough to go carry the weight. So I don't even remember if I'm answering a question. So I sat on that for 40-some years and had a business career, and that's why I finally wrote this book. I'd had a career of writing, but business plans and mergers and acquisitions and stuff, So when I finally had time to do this, I sat down about 4 years ago and started. It's the best work of my life. You will realize that. You don't know what work I've done. I've worked for NASA for 10 years and coached and won 1 million championships and was MVP of everything in baseball when I grew up. So I have some accomplishments, but this is far and away above. And I don't know. I've worked with the American Legion, and they like it, and so that's why I'm here in a cooperative program with them, and we'll be at National. But I'm not married to it. I don't even really care what people think of it. It just needed to be written, and so I had the time finally in my life, so I did. So there's most of the stories are true under different names. Probably the more outrageous the story, probably the truer it is. In Quezon and Way and convoys and things like that. 45 years leaves a few gaps, so where I felt I needed to novelize it up, I did. But I go right down Wilson Street with the Parsons boy that was in the Army, and Fred Jordan, who was bigger in life, and then the two Fox boys, a pilot, and then Max Heacock was in the Navy and running radar stuff, and Jim Willis was in the Marine Corps, and then Mike Hilton was the guy here, and then Lee Bensel, he later died as an Illinois detective on an arrest, but he was in the Marine Corps, and Larry Dyson was a topographer up in the Central Highlands. Lou Baker did, just all the guys on that street. And they came back, they did their stuff, and in all that time, we have never had one conversation about it. Hilton died, and I never talked to him once about Vietnam. And I was with him for 40 years. We never even talked about not talking about it. Matter of fact, my brother was, after I got back, he flew off the Enterprise. They rate pilots, helicopters and fixed wing, by combat missions. A combat mission is serious stuff. And he came back with over 225 combat missions. And we never once talked about it until he was my radio show guest, because we weren't face to face. If that makes any sense. Yeah, so it was just a really horrible American era, and I think it's the era where America lost its credibility, internally and externally. I think so much of the crap you see today started with the decrepit 60s and 70s, where it became standard procedure to begin to care more. Politicians began to care more about politicians than they did about the people they were supposed to be serving. And there's a million examples of that. I mean, it used to be politicians avoided saying grossly stupid things in public on television. Now it's common sense. I mean, we're supposed to pass a major changing bill to find out what's in it. Well, how dumb is that? I mean, it used to be if you said something like that, you paid some sort of political price. And I think it all changed in the 60s. I think America lied to itself and about the Vietnam War, and had to stay in it. I think it was about deals, about expending leftover ordnance from World War II and Korea, and more deals. But it wasn't about winning the war, and that's when we started as a country to not care about winning wars, just to get in them. And I think all of that is duplicated in Afghanistan. Now it's out of control. Now the lid cannot be put back on it. And I'm speaking basically about the Middle East. You can't out-ordinance and out-manpower them with a volunteer army and gutless politicians. I don't know who's going to pay the price for that. Somebody will, someday. And it'll be a horrendous price. But anyway, back to Vietnam. You got a question?
When you returned home, how were you treated?
Well, I was told before I left Vietnam not to wear my uniform when I came home. That's in the book too. My sidekick went back before me, and then he wrote me and told me what was going on, and that's in the book. And like I said, I think it was like 12 days before I hit California that I was in college at Eastern Illinois University. I really didn't give a damn how I was treated. Nobody was tougher than I was back in those days. At that time, I was a 21-year-old Marine Corps sergeant, veteran. There wasn't anything on campus that was going to bother me. I stayed away from most people. What happened at our little college, which was about 8,000 to 10,000, I don't even know, was veterans were returning all the time, and we ended up at the VFW club. And just to stay away from students. And my college was, I was determined to spend 8 hours a day either studying or in class. And then, of course, I had to work my way through college, the GI Bill, and I did that. But we weren't particularly liked, but we didn't ask to be liked. No woman could stand this young woman, the college, nor could we stand them, because they were worried about their lipstick, and we just survived Vietnam. We didn't give a damn about any of that. Another reason we weren't liked was veterans were coming back and joining together at the VFW. I eventually bartended there, and so it became kind of a mix of all veterans coming back, and we had some big time ex-college athletes, so we formed intramural teams. And part of the fun was with intramural teams we could legally beat the hell out of students, and we did on football games and basketball games anytime we had a chance. And that was kind of our revenge for their cutesy mama's ways, and we loved that. In our little town, or Charleston, in that small college, the town was kind of run by clubs, the Moose, the VFW, so we all went to work in the clubs. So we had kind of our own underworld of college, and we didn't give a damn if anybody liked us or not. I don't know ever befriending anybody there other than our veterans and the townspeople. In fact, we had an intramural softball game once. Right across from the campus was a bar called Ike's. We parked our cars at Old Main and went over to Ike's. Unbeknownst to us, and not our fault, while we were in Ike's, a war protest started. And it started in front of Old Main, right where we had parked our cars. Well, after a couple of hours of post-game beer drinking, and we came out and we looked over and went, a war protest. And that was the last war protest that they ever had around that university, because we ran those kids halfway out of town. 30 or 40 well-served veterans the students weren't ready for. So that was one of the highlights of my college, actually. That was fun. Then we had a reputation for beating everybody up, and then they really stayed away from us, which was fine. But in my hometown, little hometown, everybody knew each other, and so many kids were coming and going that I was treated just fine there, and nobody knew what to say to you. And I don't remember ever caring. I think on the bigger picture, people make more out of it. You hear about these Vietnam vets that can't get it together and live on the street. And, well, there's other people, classes that do that. I mean, that's not because of the Vietnam War. That's because they make those decisions. Our group all became professionals and graduated from college. I even graduated. So I never bought that. And nobody ever would come up to us and give us the baby killer stuff, and they wouldn't live through it. And so we didn't have any of that. I know it went on, but we didn't have any of it. It just wasn't practical for anybody to do that to us for their own good. It took, I bet I didn't have a date for year and a half. You know, if I said hi to a young lady and she said hi back, I thought that was progress. You know, I mean, you just didn't know how to talk to anybody. So what else can I tell you?
How did your wartime experience affect your life?
Well, probably in ways that I did not realize. I'm farther away from being a liberal as you can get, and so what's the opposite of a liberal? A liberal being liberties. Anything is pretty much. Some of these people don't care. You know, yeah, because it's too difficult. But so I suppose I'm a disciplinarian. I have goals that like this, writing this book. I didn't tell anybody I was writing it for well over 2 years because it was such a massive project. I didn't want to tell somebody I was going to do something and then not finish it. Yeah, that's just not the way I am. But I grew up with a German immigrant grandfather that had a hand as big as 3 footballs, and he used it, which was okay. I actually enjoyed boot camp. It was a breeze physically for me, and not too many people will admit that. So the disciplinarian fitness I always had, and I suppose I viewed things around me in my career from that kind of background, but I don't recall making it a big deal. I had a career interviewing a lot of people, and I remember the first time that I ran into the Vietnam era, and I was interviewing a guy, and in his background, he used Vietnam era, and it was like 2 minutes into the interview. And I said, well, where were you in Vietnam? And he says, I wasn't in Vietnam. And I said, well, it says right here. And he says, it's the Vietnam era. And I just blew up. Now, since then, it's kind of common that Vietnam era this and Vietnam era that. But that affected me that day. I kicked him out of the office. I don't even know what got into me. It just infuriated me that someone would use that. So that day it did. Infected that guy too, as he ran out of the office. But I don't know. Writing this book, I don't wear the Vietnam thing on my sleeve. I don't talk to people about it. I don't even talk to veterans about it. So to sit down and dredge all this up after 45 years, I thought would be a little risky for me. But the few people that I've talked to about it, this is the book release here today. Not very long into this project, the project took over me rather than me taking over the project. And I know that I don't know that I can explain that, but it almost pulled me along. We have in our small town, Monticello, we have a Medal of Honor recipient. That's a big deal. And I know the family, I knew him. And so I studied that for months before I wrote. And then I didn't want to release it if it was going to make the family mad. So I even went to the family, and I even went to that Marines unit reunion in Detroit to talk to people whose lives he had saved. So, well, if you do all that and sit down to write, it almost wasn't any of my background writing that. I had another chapter in here. I won't tell you what it is. But I did not want to write it, just dreaded it. So I went to North Carolina, and I talked to Quincy, the POW guy, and talked to some people that will talk, and then I don't have to face every day. So I thought, God, I gotta write this last freaking chapter. Well, all of a sudden, I was gonna start it on a Monday morning. And I thought, well, Sunday I'll sit down and make some notes. Now, I've been avoiding this chapter for 4 years. Well, my notes turned into writing, as I recall, late Sunday morning, and I finished the chapter Monday morning. I'd put it off for 4 years and wrote it in less than 48 hours. Now, when you read that, you'll know why. I don't even need to tell you any more about it. But that was, that was almost, the book is 8 chapters. They're long chapters. Many of them are 95 pages, 90 pages, 80 pages. That was the shortest one. I think that one's 30 or something like that. And although there's 8 chapters, this is chapter 7. I just avoided that long. I even wrote chapter 8 before I wrote chapter 7. So I finally had to get to it. And once I did, it just flowed. And I suppose it was some sort of weird stored up personal stuff. You'll know when you read it. It's riveting, and it's a true story. That's one of those you would go, could this be true? And all of it is true. So when you sit in the front window and it's 5 degrees and the snow's flying and you're doing stuff that's 45 years old, you don't know if anyone's going to care. Well, eventually I didn't care if anyone cared. Frankly, I still don't. The book needed writing. I mean, you're just all alone with those thoughts. So we'll see. Who cares? I don't know. I really don't. American Legion likes it. Really wouldn't have me here. And that's why I'll be at the National too. And I don't know where it's going to go. I've read many books on Vietnam. This is the best I've ever read. Some of it that I wrote 3 years ago I didn't look at it again until the editing process, which may have been 2 years later. You can't write and edit and write and edit and edit. You have to put it away and then come back, or at least I can't. So when I went back to finish it and put it together to print it, some of the stuff was kind of new to me. I mean, it wasn't new to me. It was I could read it with a fresh mind. And I thought, wow, this is good. If anybody wants to know about Vietnam, which they say they do, and people won't talk, well, this is it. It's from the ground floor. It's from the eyes of flying into Hill 881 on Khe Sanh and what you do when you get there. It's the famous Battle of Hue was it's in there from my perspective. It's not what you think. Especially with the people, the Vietnamese, who crawl out of their holes and try to give you their children and stuff like that. So it's kind of answers those years of, well, tell me about Vietnam. Which no one did and does. So there it is. Don't ever ask me again. Read the book. If you can't do that, then you don't care. So maybe every Vietnam vet, I'd carry one around and go, "Would you read the book?" No, I'll read the book. And if you're still interested, I'll maybe talk or not talk. I don't know what will happen from this book. It's been suggested by mostly the radio people in California. They're attempting to syndicate my show and sell it to Armed Forces Radio. But there's other stuff behind that. It's been suggested that I should try to be some sort of a spokesperson for Vietnam veterans. Well, there's got to be better people than I. I mean, generals and colonels and more educated people, but no one seems to be doing it. From my experience in interviewing and talking to people, there is a huge, frustrated, boiling group that want to do something, not in revenge, but to help save America, I guess, these days. And they don't have a rallying point. I almost think that there's the Tea Party group over here, which are conservative, disciplinarian, constitutionalists. And I don't think they even know this group is over here that are too. They just don't know a Tea Party person or something. And as I talk to both, that I think that would be a significant force in America that's needed. But I'm not the guy to put it together, nor do I want to be, I don't think. It has been suggested that I get 4 or 5 veterans of different types, and I'm thinking of myself and Quincy Collins, the Air Force guy, and the POW, and I run into other people too, and be able to speak at groups as a panel. It's kind of what I do on the radio show. We always talk about Vietnam, but then we go into more contemporary issues. At various things like the 40 and 8 Club and the Freedom Breakfast in Charlotte, and I really think it should be done. But I'm not going to do it. I mean, I would be a panelist, but I don't have the resources to pull that together. Nor do I want. If someone asked me to help them, I probably would. So, you want to know why we went to Vietnam? The bombshell. If you ask people why we went to Vietnam, 50% will say to kind of depends on the age, but 50%. Even some of the veterans that don't know what to say to that will say, well, it's like communism. I find that some of the mid-young or younger say, I don't know. We'll all be killed for this, you know. I came to the conclusion that a major driving impetus for the escalations in Vietnam concerns itself with who killed President Kennedy. If you chronology the history of the era, Kennedy was killed November 22nd, 1963. And the notorious global criminal LBJ then took over and ramped up Vietnam pretty damn quick. In fact, he then needed a reason to do that. And I don't know the exact date, but sometime in early June, 64, 6 months plus after Kennedy, there was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was North Vietnamese attacking one of our small destroyers in the South China Sea. And that then was blasted out as they've attacked us, now we have to defend ourselves, therefore we can be in Vietnam and kill all the people we want to, because we've got all these Wilson Street boys over there that are available through their draft boards to go fight our war for us, and we can sell stuff. And that's the reason Vietnam started. After that, it was just too juicy in the military industrial to give up until eventually you had to. I forget where I was going with that, but anyway, the book gave me a chance to study all that and try to put those dates and chronologies and perspectives together, and so that it filled a lot of, it not only created a lot of what I think is valuable knowledge, but it created various perspectives. I don't think America has a clue why we went to Vietnam. If they do, they don't tell me when I'm asking. And I think it started with Kennedy, which was a reaction to the Cuban issues and the Bay of Pigs issues. And if you study the era, the only one that had a real clue was Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy was then running for president. And Bobby Kennedy gave a speech, I forget the name of it. I think it was February 8th, 1964 in Chicago, where he blew the lid off the top of why we're in Vietnam. That speech is analyzed in this book. I not only give the points, but then I paraphrase what I think he's talking about, and I compare it to Afghanistan. 4 months later, he was killed by a guy, another faceless assassin, as in Oswald, under circumstances that I put together in the book that are nefarious at best, by another faceless guy who was led to a position underneath that hotel exit by a CIA guy. I forget his name. It might be Lopez. It's in the book. So when you study all that, study that era, and then the build-up and the LBJ, and of course, I even think LBJ was in the mafia back pocket out of the Marcello family of New Orleans that went through East Texas. So I come to all those conclusions. And then I come to the conclusion of, therefore, why Vietnam? What the hell are we doing there? It's on the other side of the earth. It's a third world ancient country who's been warring for centuries. What is it that you're going to gain compared to losses anyway? So 58,314 dead kids later is not worth it anymore. because Walter Cronkite figured it out from the Tet Offensive, and the politicians can't cover it up anymore. So I didn't come out with a "I hate America" attitude. I just came out the misleading and the wastes we've had because of that era, and nobody's doing very much about it. In fact, it's getting worse. And I didn't go in with a comparison between Vietnam and Afghanistan, but I sure came out that way. What's to win? What are you doing? We spent $41 million on one prison in Afghanistan that never opened. I mean, who's writing that business plan? We put a 4-lane highway all the way around Afghanistan, and it's just like Vietnam. You no sooner get the damn thing laid down and they blow up the back part up. Well, how stupid do you have to be? So it's not about Afghanistan as a war, it's about the deals. Since I'm fairly young, I've been asked if I'm going to write another one, which I didn't know. I didn't plan on through all this. But this book, I changed the ending to this so that you're left lingering with a new generation at boot camp in San Diego, and the two main characters get back together. So, I kind of know what I'm going to write, but I don't know. I won't. I don't know when. With all those assumptions, and we no longer have Hessians because we no longer have Wilson Street Boys because we no longer are drafted. We can't. It's volunteers. So it's a big American hairball. Why can't we reduce the illegal drug trade? What are we doing in Afghanistan, the largest opium producers in the world? There is an international arms trade, gun running. Do you know who the monopoly is on that? The U.S. Well, where does the money come from for that? I came to the conclusion it comes from the drugs trade because it's unmarked and unaccounted for and blah, blah, blah. And I think all that started in the Vietnam era of political chicanery and lying, and I think that's what Benghazi's all about. That's why they cover up on Benghazi. That's why the new Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Syria are so well armed, because of gun running. Afghanistan has been all about gun running for 25 years. Do you know the Charlie Wilson story? Read the Charlie Wilson. That's where it started. It got heavy for the U.S. So anyway, to me it all ties together from the 60s up into the slow bleeding and desecration of America. So I didn't go into the book project feeling any of that. That's just the conclusions I came to. And when you see the Nancy Pelosi's of the world wanting to pass laws so they can find out what are in them, and the demented Harry Reids of the world, I think all that started in the 60s. While families were doing their work and boys were trying to live through Vietnam and they came back. So anyway, see, the Vietnam War didn't affect me at all, did it? I'm just a normal guy.
Well, at this time I'd like to thank you for your interview and for the time that you have given us.
Well, we've probably been here way too long, haven't we?